let's start with my lecture. It's critical examining the history and philosophy of IE, especially the history of its philosophy from gender-sensitive and feminist perspectives. My talk does not cover the broad and deep political and media-relevant topic of IE and gender. This would require more than an hour. I just want to offer suggestions for rethinking the history of philosophy of IE from a gender-sensitive perspective, because after all, shaping the future cannot succeed without critical reflection on the history. At the beginning of my talk, you may be expecting me to answer the questions, what is AE and what is it for? And you probably want to know what I'm talking about and what the summer school is actually about. And you have, of course, the right to know it. However, it's not easy to provide a simple, clear and precise answer to the questions, what is AE and should it be? Because the term is political charged, its history is contingent and also emotional overloaded. In my approach, I try to foster the awareness that why it's important that we should critically examine the history and philosophy of AE, especially the history of its philosophy, and how we can do that. And the approach I prefer is to focus on a social technological perspectives of intelligence. A role model is, for example, Matteo Pasquinelli's book, The Eye of the Master. Why? Because in this book, Pasquinelli offers a far-sighted and critical view of IE's history from a social, economic, and philosophical perspective, which addresses ethical issues far beyond the conventional understanding of a technology assessment approach. And the title, The Eye of the Master, is a metaphor borrowed from Karl Marx, and Pasquinelli uses this metaphor to put out that Marx's concept of the general intellect or the mind as a social fact means collective knowledge and social cooperations integrated into the machinery and technology or the mechanizations and technologizations of our environment. According to Pasquinelli, IE reflects collective human knowledge and behavior encoded in algorithms and embodied in social relationships. And accordingly, when we speak about memory, the politics of making memory is crucial. So the first and maybe easy, but in fact really difficult questions. Let's start with why questions. Why gender equality? Why women and gender research in AE? Why history of AE? Why history of philosophy AE? And why a gender-sensitive perspective on the history of philosophy of AE? So the simple answer why gender equality seems to be gender equality is a fundamental human right and a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous and sustainable world. But you all know the typical objection is often gender equality is primarily a political and social goal, not a scientific one. A scientific research should not be reduced to supporting a predetermined political agenda. Now, how to counteract this objection? It's correct that equality is a human right. It's not an observable fact. It cannot be scientifically verified or falsified. However, it's not the right way to confuse ethics with politics. And second, scientific research plays a crucial role in understanding the root causes of gender inequality by providing data and insights, identifying barriers to equality, and evaluating the effectiveness of intervention. So gender equality is not a manifestation of, for example, left-leaning political ideologies, but essential part of human rights, and this goes back to ethical roots and ideas. And now, why women in gender research in AE? The short answer, the underrepresentation of women and minorities in science is a long-known fact, and it's therefore important to make women and minorities visible as role models, as these campaigns and initiatives will help to encourage a gender equitable future, so the vision. Again, one possible objection might be the promotion of women's visibility is political naive, fostering what should be criticized. That means an elitist scientific culture, because just promoting some privileged women fosters new hierarchies. Further, that the autonomy between man and woman represents a simplistic categorization, and therefore the focus on making women visible is completely misguided. So, how to counteract this objection? Maybe a question now for you. Have you any ideas? No? Okay. Then, women's and gender studies are instrumental in raising awareness of these problems, of the danger of creating unequal hierarchies, for example, in research practice. But it cannot be the conclusion that because of the risk of creating new hierarchies, nothing is done and just leave it as it is, because a lack of diversity leads to biased research outcomes that fail to address the needs of the entire population. Therefore, their commitment to advancing equality, diversity, and inclusion in the research ecosystem is an essential part of research equality. Now, at the first look, completely independent of gender and women issues, why history of AE at all? Possible answer, the history of IE provides a more accurate and well-founded picture of the subject in order to gain a more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the complexity of our histories. One objection, doing history is always driven by interest, therefore history is never value-free, neutral or objective. This also applies to the history of science, or more specifically to the history of IE. Maybe you all have read George Orwell's novel 1984 with this famous quote, "Who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past." A possible counteracting this objection is, it's true, history often reflects and reinforces deep cultural inequalities, biases, and stereotypes instead of uncovering them. However, it's up to us to do a sustainable history of science, which encourages historians to engage with multifaceted contexts and opens door to inclusivity, recognizing the history is not a monolithic story, but a tapestry of diverse structures, networks, and experience. So, and here comes the keyword responsibility in place for doing history of science, to engage critically with the past. This does not mean uncritically replacing, for example, male heroism with female heroism, but providing a more accurate and well-founded picture of the subject based on historical data, based on archival materials, etc. Now, maybe the more challenging questions, how to bring women's studies and gender research into the history and philosophy of IE. And one possible approach is to explore the so-called Matilda effect. Do you ever heard about the Matilda effect? What is the Matilda effect? Yeah.
The thing is that when if you it's the opposite of the fact where if you are in a good position where people cite you, Google cite it more and get better options, and so you go up, and Twitter is kind of a difference to this, that if you are in a position where less people will cite you, you will get even more unknown.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, the Matilda effect is the counterpart of the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect says the richer get always richer, the famous get always more famous, and the Matilda effect is the other side, and it also faces the problem of the underestimation and disregard of women's innovative achievements and scientific works because of this interrelationship of inequalities. And it was the historian Margaret Rosita introduced the term the Matilda effect to honor Matilda Joslyn Gage, who championed women's rights from the 19th century. And Matilda Joslyn Gage published also in gender research a meaningful work. It's called Women as Inventors. In this work, Gage criticized the patent system. Yeah, in the 19th century, women were not allowed to apply for patent rights and for inventions. This has to be done by the husbands, yeah. And similar, they had a lot of obligations and not at the same time the rights, for example, to go to university and to study, etc., etc. And the article by Margaret Rosita, where she tries to make aware of the underestimations of women's impact in science and research, is also an allusion to Robert Merton's work on the Matthew effect, which described the positive feedback loop of prestige and fame among scientists, exemplified by the Nobel laureate system. And the Matilda effect, so in short, means the underestimation of women's impact and role in scientific research. And meanwhile, we have a lot of, especially data-based statistical research coming from gender research. For example, here on the Matthew effect for man and woman with respect to the publication culture and the discrepancy of publishing articles in high-ranking journals. But how do we can counteract from an historical point of view this Matilda effect? One simple answer might be writing biographies, more biographies on female women. One objection might be, well, doing biographical research in the history of science is more or less problematic and outdated because we don't have this kind of heroism in the history of science. But this is also a fact. We have much more monographs and biographies on men than on women, and here a work was done just looking at Wikipedia sites where monographs, biographies on female scientists were compared to male scientists, and here the result is quite obvious. 85% biographies on male scientists, and also interesting minorities, the others, diverse group, are nearly zero. But coming back, I think writing biographies is, because of that reason, not too bad, and it opens the door for a better possibility to reconstruct scientific networking and to revisit standard narratives and to change perspectives. And against this background, it's also quite important to look at underestimated, for example, PhD theses, unpublished manuscript letters, etc., and also to include other approaches like labor and economic history into the history of AI and computing. And here I can just present you some snapshots from my own research, for example, on Paulette Destuche-Fevier, written some news on the Deutsche Physikalische Gesellschaft page. Why is Paulette Destuche-Fevier so interesting? She, first of all, is an interesting woman, not because she was a physicist, philosophy, and computing scientist, but she was one of the pioneers on quantum logic very early 1936, at the same time and nearly hand in hand with Birkhoff and von Neumann's famous paper on quantum logic. She published a paper on offering an approach on quantum logic based on three-value logic. And from today's perspective, this might be a little bit naive approach to quantum logic, just basing this approach on three-value logic. But at that time, it was really provocative and new, and her approach goes back, like Birkhoff and von Neumann's approach on Hilbert space formalism. Later, she did a lot of work together with her husband, Jean Destuche, on statistical interpretations of quantum physics and quantum logic. And it's interesting to reconstruct her scientific networks because very later famous people were involved in this network, like Alfred Tarski, who was forced to emigrate to the US and later build up a school of logic in Berkeley. And why is this interesting? Because Paulette received a doctorate in 1945 with a thesis on the structure of physical theories, and with this work she set the cornerstone for structuralism in philosophy of physics of the 19th century. And some years later, she was invited on an international symposium on axiomatic method and model theory to Berkeley. Patrick Suppé and Alfred Tarski invited her, and at this conference, she presented her doctoral thesis in English. And shortly after that, American philosophers like Weil and Joseph Sneed adopted this approach, but she was completely forgotten, ignored, and the American colleges gained fame. A typical example for the Matilda effect here, this entry in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Structuralism and Physics, written by Heinz-Jürgen Schmidt, where he tries to emphasize the German contributions to this position in philosophy of physics, but completely ignoring the French culture and Paulette Destuche-Fevier. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Another interesting work I'm just involved in it is another PhD thesis. Grete Hermann was a German mathematician, physicist, philosopher, political activist, and she published a doctoral thesis on the theory of polynomial ideals, 1935, and this set a cornerstone for later computer algebra. First abstract algebra, later computer algebra, to be more precise, for Buchberger's algorithm and Gröbner basis. Some colleges from mathematics and computer science told me, no, this cannot be the case. The work was 1925 and computer algebra was born in the 60s. But if you reconstruct again the historical networks, it becomes so easy to understand. Buchberger's teacher was Wolfgang Gröbner, an Austrian mathematician. And Wolfgang Gröbner studied under Noether in Göttingen abstract algebra. And for Gröbner, Bartel van der Werden's book on abstract algebra became later very important for his research. And Bartel van der Werden was the friend of Grete van Herman. In this book, Bartel van der Werden discussed Grete Herman's PhD thesis in detail. And a reviewer recognized this fact, and when Buchberger submitted his PhD thesis in form of an article to the journal Equationes Mathematicae, the anonymous referee recommended to accept, but please cite Grete Hermann, and later Buchberger did it. The Grübner basis became very important for computer algebra, and Buchberger established the biggest computer institute in Austria. And yeah, nevertheless, Grete Hermann was completely forgotten in this context. How to deal with this approach? Possible answer you can find in Nelson's article Race Computing, the Problem of Sources and the Potential of Prosperography, and appeared in the Annals of the History of Computing. In this paper, Nelson tries to make aware of the fact how important it is to do archival research and to also recognize the power archival research has in making memory culture, because archives in the past usually collected much more material on famous men than on women. As I mentioned in my abstract, I can tell you a little bit more also on famous but forgotten, or important but forgotten, women in cryptography and GPS system, because everyone knows today how important cryptography is for security in IT development and also the GPS system. And here, just to give you another example, Ankara Christie, a pioneer in the application of early computers in cryptanalysis, was for a long time completely ignored by the community, or Lady West, who was the lady, so to say, the black woman behind the mathematical modeling for the global positioning system, GPS. But the government at that time forbid her that she was photographed, she became in the press, not just because she was a woman, but she was a black woman. So we have this, what we say in gender research, the problem of intersectionality. More factors and aspects play a role for discrimination, in this case, to being black human being and to being woman. Yeah, but so for the Matilda effect and how we might be counteracted, maybe the more challenging approaches to explore and to investigate gendered spaces, gendered stereotypes deeply embedded in the history of philosophy of AIM. And this has to do with the more general philosophical problem of anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism, you all know that, I think, is the process of attributing human characteristics onto non-human objects that are not physically there, and it is closely interrelated to human likeness, objective, physically observable characteristic and traits that are human-like or purposeful design. We have a lot of discussions at the moment on this topic of anthropomorphism and its interrelationship of developing scientific terminologies. And from a gender perspective, this is quite interesting, because we have a lot of gendered terminology in scientific terminology. For example, here, and I just give you here 2 examples, many more. In the context of nuclear physics, the terms parent and daughter describe the relationship between nucleids during radioactive decay, where the parent nucleid transforms into the daughter nucleid by emitting radiation, and the parent is the original unstable nucleid that undergoes decay, while the daughter is the resulting of a more stable nucleid. And the process is now, and here comes the anthropomorphism into play, analogous to parent transforming into a child. Yeah, another example, electrical connectors are classified by gender, male and female. And you can just look at the internet and Amazon, and we have a lot of catalogs. It's a typical Anglophone terminology, and you can see here then differences described between male and female connectors, uses of male and female connectors, example of female connectors when gender is a factor in design. And here this cartoon makes the problem quite obvious, I think. So the man tells the woman in engineering, remember to connect male to female. Why assign gender roles to electrical connections? Let the circuits decide their own identities. Yeah, in a technical context, this doesn't work. So now my two last examples are more or less an reference to the talk we heard yesterday by Rudolf Seising. Very famous McCulloch and Walter Pitt's paper on the logical calculus of the ideas immanent in nervous activity became an essential part of history of IE. And I quote from this paper, where the authors claim that their model is of interest as affording a psychological justification of the Turing definition of computability and its equivalents, church lambda definability and Kleene primitive recursiveness. If any number can be computed by an organism, it is computable by these definitions, and conversely. My critical questions, I'm not alone, it comes from feminist science and technology studies. Is it really a cell that calculates and fires, or the organism, or are we not rather attributing these abilities to the cells? So is it not the other way around, that we are attributing mathematical models to nervous activities? And this is my switch to the last famous example, the imitation game. We heard it yesterday, created by Alan Turing. And for me, it's important to emphasize that the imitation game, in the original sense, published by Alan Turing, asks a computer to not only imitate a thinking human, but a specific gender of thinking human. And here, it's quite important to understand the historical background. And I have written here some notes published, for example, by research article, Can Machines Think? The controversy that led to the Turing test, by the historian Gonçalo. I'm not sure if I'm reading this. No, it's not here mentioned. I'm sorry. But the paper is, according to my opinion, important because the paper reconstructs in detail, Bernardo Gonçalves is the author, reconstructs in detail the historical context where Turing has published this paper. And indeed, it was a discussion behind this paper between the physicist and computer pioneer Douglas Hardy, the chemist and philosopher Michael Polanyi, and the neurophysiologist Geoffrey Jefferson. And Turing was dissatisfied with Jefferson's opinion, and he challenged Jefferson's thesis that gender-specific behavior was determined by sex hormones, because Turing himself was homosexual. And Turing intended to show that gender-specific behavior is not causally determined by sex hormones, but it's more or less constructed and learned through imitation. And 2 years later, you all know it, maybe Turing was sentenced to chemical castration for his homosexuality, which was at that time a criminal offense. And later he became depressed as a result of the treatment and died by suicide 2 years later. And against this historical background, I think the Turing test can be seen as a warning message concerning society's treatment of homosexuality based on alleged scientific data and facts. At the same time, it draws attention to the wider issues of human beings becoming part of a technological environment, a process that is closely linked to the anthropomorphization of technology and the other way around, the technologization of human beings. And here a quote by Catherine Hales, again, from Feminist Science and Technology Studies. Often forgotten is the first example Turing offered of distinguishing between a man and a woman. If your failure to distinguish correctly between human and machine proves that machines can think, what does it prove if you fail to distinguish woman from man? Why does gender appear in this primal scene of humans meeting their evolutionary successors, intelligent machines? And again, we are faced here with the problems of anthropomorphism. Here, a new research paper dealing in much more detail what anthropomorphism in the human-machine interactions might be in future. But as I tried to make clear, that anthropomorphization and technologization is deeply involved, and in the usual case, a price has to be paid, something is lost, and often, according to my opinion, but maybe you see it in a different way, it's often the ethical dimension what is lost. By reducing, for example, human interactions to technological environments. Yeah? But this is an open, nevertheless, I think, important question. So let me end with this talk, and maybe we have a lot of time for discussion.